everyone. We are back looking at 1 Corinthians. This is lesson 10, and we're going to continue in the second part of looking at marriage, divorce, singleness, if you will. These are some of the topics that Paul's been covering. He's going to address a few more things here, and we're going to be looking this time at chapter 7, verses 17 through 40. As we begin, though, we have to remember that Paul's been dealing with issues of marriage and divorce, and sometimes we get wrapped up in the details, and the details are important. I'm not saying that they're not, but sometimes we forget that when Paul is trying to communicate things to us, he's trying to say, okay, you guys had questions about this. I'm addressing these questions, but I'm also going to help you understand a way to think, because this has been the problem the Corinthians have been having. Even if they have a lot of knowledge, they don't understand how to apply it, and very often that's for us, we have the same challenge. Have you ever read a verse when you're in a particular situation, you go, whoa, that's what that means. Well, Paul's going to kind of do that same kind of thing for the Corinthians. And this morning, in the second part of chapter 7, he's going to really kind of look at, if you will, three kind of ideas. And first off, he's going to talk about, you guys are so tied up in the way you want to think about social status, background, lifestyle, one thing being more superior, because that's one of the things we've been seeing the Corinthians have been having is this challenge of, what's spiritual maturity. And in particular, he's addressed already partly, and he's going to continue to reiterate this about dealing with celibacy being some kind of wondrous, over-the-top, amazing spirituality. And he's pretty much going to say, well, yeah, that might be good if it's given to you, but in general, that's nothing more than anything else. Because he's going to also try to help them understand that their perspective really needs to be a perspective that says, I need to live as best I can in whatever circumstance I'm in, with an undistracted devotion to the Lord. So in other words, as little distraction as you can have, the better it is you can focus on what the Lord would have you to do. Even though in our daily lives, we know that, and like Paul writes to the Romans in chapter 12, that what we do and how we live our life is our spiritual sacrifice of worship. In other words, the way we live our life is worshipful. So he's going to talk about that a little bit. And also he's going to help people realize it's not that there's anything wrong with being in the world, if you will, being part of the society, dealing with normal things of life, whatever time and culture and place that you're in. That's not a problem. But he said, you really need to understand this from an eternal perspective. You need to be thinking about it to saying, how important is this in light of eternity? Now, we talk about that, but he's going to put it in some pretty concrete terms. He's going to continue on, and he's going to bring up some, if you will, ancillary things as we go through this. He's going to talk about being a slave or not being a slave. He's going to talk about being single or about not being single or married or divorced, or what you should do in the relationships between singleness. And then he puts it in their cultural context, which some of it's a little bit foreign to us, but the principles still apply. So as we walk through here, I really want you to try to think about this in the terms that he's trying to get us to understand. He's saying, let me give you a whole series of examples of how you should be thinking about these situations. And with all of those principles, and in particularly dealing with intimate or complicated or difficult situations, marriage, singleness, slavery, things like that, I want you to begin to put these in practice in your thought process, in the way you then live. So even though a lot of this, again, deals with marriage and divorce and singleness and things like that, there's a lot of principle in here that we can apply to every situation. If you really think about it, that's how we learn. That's how children learn. How would a child learn when you say, don't hit your brother or don't hit your sister? Well, can I poke them? Or can I chop them? Can I kick them? Can I, stick out my tongue at them? They're going to try every different way to figure out, can I get away with it? Versus the principle is stop being mean. Okay, let me explain to you what mean is. Kicking them, that's mean. Hitting them, that's mean. Sticking their tongue out, that's mean. Saying nasty things, that's mean. Don't do it. So, whole bunch of examples that then form the understanding of what does it mean, don't be mean to them. We're going to see Paul do that same stuff here. So let's go ahead and dive in. And there's some tricky passages here in particular we'll get to, but let's just sort of walk here and see that he is going to start off with this idea, and this is in your notes, you'll see it's labeled contentment, sovereignty, and obedience. And that's the thing that's going to be a challenge for us. I think the first part is contentment. So let's begin. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 through 20. Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each one, in this manner let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He's not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is keeping the commandments of God. Each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. So, right off the bat, we can see that Paul brings up these ideas of sovereignty, obedience, and contentment. Only as the Lord has assigned to each one. So he says, okay, here's where God has you. Here's where God has me. Here's how God has whoever. He has each one. This is where you're supposed to be. And sometimes we wonder, Lord, are you sure this is where I'm supposed to be? But he says, all right, God is sovereign in this, as he's done this. And as God has called. In other words, he is the one who's called us. And in this particular case, and we're going to see in here, it's sort of a dual calling. Whatever situation you're in when you are called as a believer, or whatever situation you are in your general calling. So he works it in both ways. But in particular, he's trying to deal with your calling in the condition you're in as a believer. He says, and in this manner walk. Excuse me. And so I direct in all the churches. So Paul's not picking on the Corinthians, saying this principle applies to everybody, and that's what we want to see. So he says, all right, be content where you are. God's put you there, and therefore walk in a manner that's worthy of whatever place you are in your calling as a believer, 1, and 2, as a believer in a situation, 2. So, obedience, contentment, sovereignty. God's put you there, be content there, and live there. Isn't that something we've been seeing as we've been walking through this whole letter? And we're going to see it, we just continues on through the rest of his letter to the Corinthians. And so he says, all right, I direct this to everybody, a universal principle. And then he goes on, he starts talking about circumcision and uncircumcision. And if you're called when you're circumcised or when you're not circumcised, you shouldn't try to become the other. So what's he really getting at there? What do you think? Well, there is Judaic law. That's true. That's true. When he's talking about this circumcision and uncircumcision, might deal with that. Well, what else? What else is he really trying to get at? Yeah. He's talking about whether you were a Jew or a Gentile, because that's basically what the circumcision, uncircumcision, that's how he would have understood it, and a lot of these people would have understood it, is if you're circumcised, that's the sign of being a Jew. If you're uncircumcised, you'd be a Gentile. So he's saying, look, if you're Jew or Gentile, don't try to become a Jew if you're a Gentile, and don't try to Gentile if you're a Jew. Be as you are, whatever situation you find here. So it's not about circumcision, because he says circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing. He's already just saying, look, we're one in Christ. So stop worrying about whether you were circumcised or not. Now, we know that Paul does address certain issues with Timothy and other places about having him circumcised, but there's a reason for that. But in general, he says what really matters is in verse 19. What matters is keeping the commandments of God. And so he said, your life is what is important, and how you live unto God, which is what is important. That's how we should be thinking in these situations, wherever we are, however we are. Be content and live out your life in accordance with the way God would have you live it. That can be applied for all sorts of stuff, and we're going to see how he does that here in these particular matters. Now, verse 20 is a little bit trickier, because he says each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. Now, do you think saying, okay, well, I'm here, and I can't do anything different, and I'm not going to do anything different. I'm not going to get a raise, not going to get a promotion, I'm not going to go anywhere. This is how I am. Do you think that's really what he's trying to get at based on what he's already said? And, of course, we're going to see he's going to explain it in a second. Do you think that he says you can't change? You think that's true? No, it's not. You're right. He's not getting at that, though the words kind of sound that way when you start looking at them. But let's go ahead and look here and see what he continues on with. And this begins in dealing with contentment, sovereignty, and while you're a slave, okay, how are you going to live? So this is verses 21 through 24. He says, were you called while a slave? do not worry about it. But if you are also able to become free, rather do that. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You are bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. So you notice here, he comes back and he says the same thing, but he's giving the explanation. He says, if you were called while you were a slave, don't worry about it. Okay? Be content in that. Now, when we think about slavery, we think about, the Civil War or slavery and that kind of time period. Slaves in this particular time, some of them were treated very badly. Absolutely, no question about it. But whether you realize it or not, in the Roman Empire, I've used this example in other places, somebody could the Roman army comes in and conquers a city. And they find out that the person who was running the city was tremendously gifted at logistics. In other words, man, you guys almost beat us. You were able to keep things going and keep your population doing well. Well, they might come in and instead of saying, oh, we're going to kill you because you're really good at administering logistically, they'd say, hey, you're now a slave. Guess what? We're going to make you, Secretary of Commerce or in the Interior or whatever back in Rome because you're really good at it. Well, you're a slave with a mansion with slaves, but you're still a slave. He says, so if you're called in that way, and again, not all of them are that way, but it's a very much wider range than what we're used to thinking in. If you were called that way, don't worry about it. Because if you're a slave, if you're under somebody else's control, you're still Christ's freedman. You're still free in Christ. He has freed you from sin and death and everything else that's important. And then he says, but if you're able to become free, do that. Now, we're going to get to why, but why do you think right now, just as what we've talked about so far, what do you think might be why he would say, if you're able to do that, that might be better? Okay? Yeah, just being free in general could be better. But remember, we know that there are people who want to be a bondservant. In other words, my master treats me well, I'm going to stay as their slave. So not always, but generally, yes, it would be better for them that way. But think about this. As we opened up, we were talking about that Paul wants them to be as undistracted as possible to serve the Lord. Well, if you're a slave, and I'll just use a modern analogy, whether it makes any sense or not. But say you were a slave and your master's throwing a party and it's going to be Sunday afternoon. Well, you're working all Sunday morning, so you can't go to church. You go, oh, isn't that terrible? Well, if you were not a slave, you would be free to do that. You could come, you could learn, you could grow, you could fellowship. So in these particular situations, it says, if you are generally able to be free to do your own thing, you will be generally able to be more undistracted to the Lord. But don't worry about it if you can't. But if you can, that'll be better. Be free. So again, he's not locking them in on, you've got to stay this way. Even though at the end of the verse, he says, brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition which he was called. So wherever you are, whatever condition you're in, remain with God in that condition. But if you're a slave, if you can be free, that's great. So if you notice here, he's really trying to get a point across, not some kind of rule set. He's trying to say, I want you to be living for God, but don't worry about what the condition that you're in. It really doesn't matter that much. I mean, yes, life might be better if you are free. Great, be free if you can. But don't say, oh, I've got to be free and rattle the chains and cause a thing and play Spartacus. I'm going to lead a rebellion because I got to be free. He says, no, don't worry about that. You're free in Christ. But, by the way, if you're free, you're slave to Christ. So when you get your freedom, it isn't your freedom to go do whatever you want. It's your freedom to be a servant of Christ. So it doesn't matter where you are, be a servant of Christ. And that's kind of what he gets to. And he goes, why is that? You are bought with a price, so don't become the slaves of men. And that doesn't mean, okay, I can't become a slave. He's trying to say, Christ has bought you. He has set you apart as different. Don't become enslaved to the way of the world. Doesn't mean you can't live in it. Doesn't mean you can't be part of it. It just means don't be slaved by it. So if people put you in a situation where you become slaves to, well, I have to be popular. Well, why? Maybe you're not popular. But, I got to be, because that's what everybody's got to say you got to be. You got to be popular. Well, now you're putting yourself, instead of under Christ, as Christ's slave, you're putting yourself under, I have to become like everybody else, slavery. You now are becoming a slave of the world, and you have to be careful about that. Now, that doesn't mean go out of your way to become unpopular. Doesn't say that either. But don't have that as your driving force, what you have to be. So again, contentment, sovereignty, obedience, even while a slave, and yet if you can become free, go for it. That's cool. That's wonderful. You'll have more undistracted ability to deal with that. So our next section, we're going to deal he's going to sort of shift back now. He's been talking about how you live based on where you are. And, one of the topics that he sort of brings in as a secondary is slavery, because that would be important in their time. Now he's going to come back and he's going to deal with marriage and singleness and divorce and things like that, because that's what he's been talking about earlier in this chapter. So now in verse 25 through 28, he says, now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord. So in other words, he's saying this isn't something that the Lord has taught on. But he says, but I give an opinion as one by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. So in other words, what I'm going to share with you is something that's probably a good thought and a good reality, and I'm a trustworthy statement and spokesman for the Lord on this particular one. I think then that it is good, in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. So the principle here that Paul says, he says, in light of this present trouble or distress, it's kind of a difficult thing. Well, what distress is he talking about? Well, it could be that just living the Christ life as a Christian. It could be there was a time of persecution. It could be who knows what. But in general, life has difficulty. It has distress. In other words, the world creates problems and you're going to have to live with them. And so he comes back and he said, if you stay where you are, just be what you are, do as God's put you, I think that'll be good. And if you're married, stay married. Be a godly husband or godly wife. And if you're single or not married, if you get yourself back into the marriage relationship, as we're going to see in another section here, it's going to be challenging. You're going to have more things that you have to do. And let me just sort of digress a little bit here. Think about the Apostle Paul himself. He says, I've been given this gift that I don't have to be married. That's just not who I am. But we know Peter and the other apostles brought along a believing wife, so they were married, and it's not a problem. But think about Paul's life. Say, one of you gals here was his wife, and you have 5 kids back home in Tarsus or Antioch or wherever he was last time. And he's out there, and he comes home, and you get word, oh, Paul's been in a shipwreck. Oh, Paul's been beaten with 39 lashes. Oh, Paul's been imprisoned here. Oh, he's been arrested in Jerusalem. How would you feel? You'd be worried. You'd be upset. You'd be fearful for him, even though, okay, Paul, I told you not to go do that. That's a crazy thing for you to do. He would be also worried about you and going, well, how's my wife going to be taken care of? How about my kids? Are they missing me? Do they have their dad there? There's all these different things. He said, and we're going to see that he's going to talk about that if you're married, life is more complicated. You're going to have less time to be fully devoted to the Lord. And that's okay. It's okay. But what does he say? If you're married, if a virgin marries, if you're single and you want to get married, you've not sinned. There's no sin in it. So there's nothing wrong with it. Nor is there higher spirituality one way or another? As the Corinthians would try to, here's your social status, here's what you should be married or you shouldn't be married or you should be celibate or whatever they want to have. He says that you've missed the whole point. It's about what is your ability to focus on the Lord. And he says, so I know there's trouble in this life, so I'm just trying to spare you from it. Well, if you're lonely, it might become a distraction. Get married. So if you notice here, he's again trying to talk about these different aspects of how to think about life. But so far, has he said anything about anybody being in sin if they marry or don't marry or remarry or whatever? He's no. There's nothing going on here. There's no problem with that. So now he moves on. He says, okay, this is how you can look at this, but let me give you even a greater perspective. I want you to look in a more eternal way. I want you to put things in their proper context, in other words. And so often we get so wrapped up in our own context, we forget that larger context. So that's what he tries to help them with now. Well, but I really want to be married. Okay, you haven't sinned, but I really want to be married. You haven't sinned. But now put marriage in its proper context so you can understand all of life. And so he's going to take this principle and he's going to bring it into many different aspects of life. So verses 29 through 31, he says, "But I say this, brethren, the time has been shortened." We'll come back to that. "So that from now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none." Wait a second, I thought it was okay to be married. Okay, we'll come to it. "And those who weep, as those who did not weep. And those who rejoice, as those who did not rejoice. And those who buy, as though they did not possess. And those who use the world, as though they did not make full use of it. For the form of this world is passing away." Now, there's a lot of things that are very interesting here. And first off, I want to just address the time has been shortened, because you kind of read that and you go, the time has been shortened. What does this mean? You know, suddenly time, God's plan got compressed. Well, if you're looking at it from a length or a period of time perspective, or a duration of time, then you're looking at a characteristic saying, well, how did it suddenly get shortened? It's not that time has gotten shortened. It's the characteristic of the time is as if it's shortened. Because if you know your goal and you know where things are going to lead and you have clarity in what's going to happen, it's like, okay, I've got to focus. I know what's going to happen. In other words, that amorphous, who knows what's going to happen type of a situation, time just sort of floats on. Time is shortened. I got an understanding of what I'm supposed to do, how I'm supposed to live. And he says, all right, so the time has been shortened, so now let me put you in that shortened time perspective, that character of the time, because it's clear Christ is going to return. The resurrection has happened. All these things that he's been talking about earlier in here, he says, I'm going to make sure you realize that here's how you ought to be thinking. So he goes and says, so from now on, those who have a life should be as though they had none. Now, is Paul then going, well, remember I told you to take care of your wife and all this stuff? Now ignore her. You think that's what he's doing? No, he's not. He's not trying to say that. But how should you live? Well, it's as if you weren't married. But I am married, and I have these responsibilities. And, we're going to talk about that in a sec. And then he says, for those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. And didn't Paul say rejoice always? You know, wait a second, you're telling me don't rejoice? You're telling me not weep? Wait a second, I'm supposed to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn and all these types of things. So he's not trying to say, remember all the stuff I've written elsewhere and you read in Scripture? Ignore that. Now, does anybody know what, if I take two ideas and I, like in the Bible it talks about the heavens and the earth. Does anybody know what the literary term for that kind of a thing, like weep and rejoice? Or what do you think weep and rejoice are representing? How about that? Maybe a better question. Okay. Two extremes. Yeah, weeping and rejoicing. That's true. That could be two extremes. But what else? Think even bigger than that, conceptually. Yeah, ranges of emotions. In other words, from all the way weeping to all the way rejoicing and everything in between. So that's technically referred to as a metonymy. In other words, like the heavens and earth mean everything. God created the heavens and earth. Okay, did he create the fish, the bacteria? Did he create stardust? Yeah, everything. What about that planet out there? No, everything, the heavens and earth. In other words, it's a way of summarizing the complete and totality. So he said, so if you notice, he's using weeping and rejoicing. So in other words, all of your life and all of those types of things, those things are not that important. Now, does that not mean you should weep with those who weep? Yes. Does that not mean you should rejoice always? Yes. But in the light of eternity, what does that really, because the shortening of time, that change of perspective, how should you understand those? Come on, parents, you should be able to come up with a real simple way if you've been helping younger parents. Okay? Here, well, if you haven't, here's a simple one. And this too shall pass. You guys have seen that, somebody struggling. When are they ever going to get out of diapers? Well, guess what? And this too shall pass. One day they will be. And so he basically is saying, look at it from that perspective. These things are important and you should live in them, but live as in the right perspective. The mourning isn't going to go all the way. Rejoicing isn't going to always go on. Being married isn't going to always be there. He continues on and he says, those who buy as though they did not possess. And he's not saying don't buy, and he's not saying don't possess. He's trying to say, what are the things that you're buying and possessing? How important are those in the light of the shortening of time, if you will? That change of perspective. Important? Yeah, I got to buy groceries. I got to get food. I got to have a place to live. Okay, nothing wrong with that. But is that really important? Is that what's holding you? No. And then he goes on and he says, and those who use the world as if they did not make full use of it. In other words, he's not saying don't buy and sell and go and trade and things like that. I mean, we see all through the book of Acts, people were buying and selling and making and working and things like that. Paul talked about how hard he worked with his own hands, right? So he's not saying life shouldn't be lived. And it's not saying that, go live in a cave as a monk and sit on the top of a hill and pray and meditate and sing all day. He's not talking about that, because even the monks, what they had to do? They still had to get something for food and water and shelter. So he's just trying to say, what is your perspective that the time is shortened? Marriage, but marriage isn't the whole thing. Weeping and the difficulties of life and the rejoicing in life, that's not the whole thing, but be part of it. Buying and selling and having, great, but that's not the whole thing. Having the world and using it and being involved in it, that's fine, but that's not really the most important thing. Because what eventually is going to happen? For the form of this world is passing away. So he said, you have to realize that everything that you live and everything that you think has to be put in that perspective. The time is shortened and this form of this world is passing away. It's not that important. It's important that you live out a godly life, and you be a godly husband to your wife and to your kids and to provide and to do all these things. Yes, but in the light of eternity, in the light of what's coming, put it in its proper perspective. Don't obsess. Don't worry. Be content. I think that's honestly one of the most difficult things for any of us. I mean, you can know where you are. You can know the situation you're in, right? I know where I am. I know what situation I'm in when I was called. I know what I'm supposed to do, the obedience that I'm supposed to do out of love for the Lord and His people, right? Hard part's being content in it, though. So he's trying to say, be content with the right perspective. The perspective will give you contentment in it. And that's hard. Believe me, there are times in my life that I'm like, wow, I am not content about this, or I'm not happy about this, and therefore sometimes grumbling and complaining and being uncontent. Yeah, I don't know if that's a word. But you need to learn to be content in it. Having that proper eternal perspective will give us that contentment, or help us with it anyway. So he then says, all right, with that contentment, with that perspective, with the situation you're called in, with the obedience you're supposed to do, here's what I really want out of this. This is the whole purpose of what I wanted to see out of it. And this is in verses 32 through 35. He says, but I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, but how he may please the Lord. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world and how he may please his wife. So he's just saying, I want you to be as unburdened as possible. Again, notice he's not saying that there's anything wrong with being burdened by these things or anything wrong with caring for a wife. And here he goes on and he says, but one who is married, and his interests are divided, right? Because they're divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about things of the Lord, that she may both be holy in body and spirit. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. I say this for your benefit, not to put a restraint on you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Is there anything wrong with being married? No. Is there anything wrong with being single? No. What's the objective Paul wants? Yeah, he wants us to be as undistracted as possible. Our attention's not being divided. Now again, that doesn't mean that what you do with a wife or a husband isn't honoring God, because it is a beautiful example. We see how it's used, marriage and things like that, with Christ and the church. But if you're spending all this time doing things for somebody else, you have less time to do things for the Lord and people and reaching out and other things, because your time is being spent and taken up elsewhere. It's divided. It's not gone. It's not over with. It's just divided. So I want you to live without concern. I want to be both appropriate and as undistracted as possible. Now, what do you think could the Corinthians, especially the way they've been thinking and the way they look at stuff, what do you think what little trap could they fall into? Yeah, they could say, well, see, Paul said that it's better to be single and to be celibate. Yeah, it might be, but he also said earlier, only if God has given that to you as a gift. If not, you're going to be frustrated. And what does he say? It's better to marry than to burn with passion. In other words, you're going to go off the path really quickly if that's not the gift God's given you. So it's much better to get married than to live that way. So it's not one way or another, it's as God has called. So again, we see that same principle coming back again. Now he goes to something in dealing with virgins or the betrothed. And here is something that's really tricky. The language permits you to translate it in two different ways. And I'm going to read to you two different ways that this passage could be translated. Now, the bottom line to this, though, just so you know, though it could be confusing, so I'll be quick about it. The bottom line is it doesn't matter which way it's translated, the same message is being transmitted and being given. Okay? So I'm going to read the first way, and then I'm going to read the second way, and I think you're going to hear the difference between the two of them. So let me read this one first. First translation. But if any man thinks he is acting unbecomingly towards his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let her marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, but has authority over his own will, and has decided in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. So then, he who gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. Okay? So again, he's using that same principle that if and this is one translation, I'm going to put it, this is the father or the guardian of this girl. And the first part of it says, and he's not acting unbecomingly towards her if she's past her youth. In other words, she's grown up to be a young woman and she's now in the age of marriage in this particular time and culture and where they are. And she might even be sort of getting past that age of when she should be getting married. And if it must be so, if you notice here, if it must be so, in other words, you have already made some commitment, she's made some commitment, some other families made some commitment, because, arranged marriages was the norm there, and matter of fact, it is in many parts of the world still. Let him do what he wishes, he does not sin. In other words, I've already made this commitment, I've already honored this, and it's got to be this way because this is what I've already honored, my word I'm given to it. Let her marry. Right? No problem. But he says he stands firm in his heart, and he's under no constraint. In other words, I have no commitments. I've got nothing honored here that I have to worry about. But I still have authority in my own will. In other words, I still have the say in this matter. And he's decided in his own heart, daughter, I think it's better that you stay unmarried. He has done well also. And it may be that his wife's died, and he needs his daughter to hang around to help out with the household. Guys, we'd burn the house down if it was all up to us. Kids would starve, things would go bad. So it may be that he says, I'd rather you stay here. Now, for a lot of young ladies today, that would be like freak out time. But in this particular world, this was normal. This was nothing unusual. People weren't going, oh, I got to go do this. I'm free. I'm emancipated. Matter of fact, if you wanted to be emancipated as a young woman in this society without a husband, you're in deep, serious, serious trouble. There's nobody to protect you. There's nobody to take care of you. There's no financial well-being, etc. It's being under your father's household or being married. The other options were not really pleasant ones. There were people in those situations, but they typically weren't the best ones. So he's saying, if you're in charge and you're under constraint and it's okay, then marry. There's no problem. And if you're not, and you're not under constraint, and you say, I want you to stay unmarried, we're not going to go into this arrangement, you've done well too. He says, so he who gives his daughter in marriage does well. He who does not give his daughter will do better. Why? Because she now has less distraction. Right? She doesn't have to have as much distraction. Now, that's one way this can be translated. Now, here's how the ESV translates it. And it's now looking at it from another perspective because the words can be translated both ways. He says, if anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his betrothed, okay? If his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let him marry, there is no sin. If you notice here, now you're looking at it from the suitor's perspective and saying, if this person thinks that, hey, man, I am just going after this gal. I've got a problem here. This is my betrothed. And my passions are strong. I just want to marry this lady. And it has to be because of my passions and the obligations that we have between us. Let him do as he wishes. In other words, I want to marry her. Please, 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 I want to marry. Let them marry. There's no sin. But whoever is firm in his heart, in other words, I'm standing here being under no necessity. In other words, I don't have anything that I have any reason that I have to marry. And having his desire under control. In other words, my passions are not that I've got to get married and I want to have a wife. They're more like Paul. I can stay under control. And has determined in his heart to keep her as his betrothed. In other words, I can just say, all right, you're going to stay that way. We're not going to get married. He will do well. You're like, wow, kind of like leaving her at the altar. He's like, no, you still have the choice. And again, these are cultural things. He would still have the choice to decide whether he is going to marry or not. And he said, I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to get married. And it may be a waiting or whatever. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, then he who refrains from marriage will do even better. So regardless of the perspective, whether it's the father giving the daughter, which is more typical, or the one who is the suitor to the betrothed, it really doesn't matter. He said, what I want you to realize is you are fine, but do what is right, what is appropriate. And one way will end up better towards undistraction and lack of concern for both parties. And the other way is going to become distracting if you're not married. So go get married. No sin. Again, what's the thinking? Eternal contentment. I'm okay with this. This is the way it is. There's no sin. There's better and worse. There's good and there's better. It's not better and worse. It's good. This is good. This is better. Again, undistracted viewpoint. So now he finally comes down to the last part, and this is talking about, he's now saying, okay, well, I've talked about marriage, I've talked about divorce, I've talked about sinning away, I've talked about slavery, I've talked about general life and everything, I've talked about singleness or getting married. He says, now I'm going to talk about contentment and remarriage. So he's going to say, okay, you're in a situation now. Let me tell you about how maybe you'll want to think about this, about getting remarried. So in verses 39 and 40, he says, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives. But if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Now, we could go into a lot of the things about whom she wishes, because that's basically saying she's not under her parents anymore. So I want to marry that guy, and that guy wants to marry me, but we're not going to go that, because that's a cultural phraseology. But he basically says, look, as long as your husband's alive, you're bound. When your husband dies, you're free. So this is basically the widow or widower situation. It says, now you're free. What is it? What we already talked about, that puts this in a particular perspective. And this is hard because when people's spouses die, this kind of can freak you out a little bit. What do you think when he says this, that she's no longer bound when in this case, her husband dies? Okay. Yeah, this goes back to what we talked about, that over-realized eschatology that the Corinthians are thinking, well, we're not going to be like the angels, neither married nor given in marriage. Yeah, the bond is broken. And as much as we love our spouses today, in eternity, they're not our spouses. You're kind of going, but till death do us part. Oh, wait a second, till death do us part. Yes, and that's what right here, till death do us part. In other words, that eternal perspective says, yes, this is important, but it isn't everything. Yes, I'm going to be a good husband or I'm going to be a good wife, but once my spouse is gone, that's broken. And that's never going to be like that again. I know that can sound a little cold, but because we love our spouses, but the reality is they're not going to be our spouses. Because see, right here he says, she's free to remarry. Okay, now what do you got? 2 spouses? No, when we're all gone and we're both dead, it's all broken. There aren't 2 spouses. So again, he's now saying, look at the life the way it is. And you're free to remarry if you want. Now, he does put a caveat on it, only in the Lord. In other words, to another believer, don't go be unequally yoked. Because if you want to have problems, be unequally yoked. And we've seen the Corinthians trying to go, oh, should I send them away? Should I not send them away? Earlier. And he's like, no, if the unbeliever wants to be with you, stay. Stay married. Don't send them away. He says, but in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I also have the Spirit of God. In other words, I think God would affirm that this is a true thing. She'll be happier being unmarried. And some gals or guys would go, are you serious? I love being married. It's great. It's wonderful. I want to be married. Okay, not a problem. Recognize you're going to have to deal with the world and your wife or your husband, and your distraction is going to be distracted. Paul's basically saying, hey, if you can have undistracted devotion to the Lord and serve and do that stuff and be free when everything, because you don't have any other obligations or responsibilities, he says, I think you're going to be happier in that because you are now going to be free to serve the Lord. He says, and I think God would agree with that. Again, though, you want to get remarried after a spouse's death? You're free. There is no bondage, there's no boundary, there's no limit except in the Lord. And so, to sort of wrap all this up, everything Paul's been talking about here is, think about how the Lord would have you live. Think about that the Lord is sovereign and He's placed us all where we are in the proper time and the proper family and everything else. And that doesn't matter how good or bad of an upbringing you had, or good or bad parents you had, or wealthy or poor, or anything in between. God says, wherever you are when I call you, be content, live in that. Now, can you grow? Certainly. Can you live? Certainly. Can you get married? Certainly. Can you remarry? Yes. Can you be single? Yes. Can you do all these things in life and living? Yes. If you're a slave, can you become free? Yes. But, eternal perspective, time has been shortened. Be content in wherever you are. And if God permits you to grow and develop and do other things, praise God. But think about when you make your decisions, is this going to create more problems for my devotion to the Lord? Or is it going to be freeing? Sometimes you may be presented with a promotion that's now going to cost you 10 to 12 hours a day. So not only are you, you got the promotion, you got the stress, the headache, you got the money, but you're not going to be around your family. And yes, when it comes to, hey, we're going to help people move, or we're going to do this, or I'm going to teach a community group, or whatever happens to be, you're not going to have the time. Well, maybe that promotion and that extra money, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe that's not a wise decision. So be thinking. Maybe if you want to get married, but you realize, okay, I can live this way, and you get married, well, what does that bring with it? Maybe you shouldn't. I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't, but it's that thinking. God is sovereign. He's placed me here. Be content and live in a way that honors Him in all these situations. And so that kind of wraps up something that a lot of times we get also locked in on all the rules and regulations in here. Paul's really teaching us how to think about life, how to think about marriage, how to think about relationships, how to think about our position. And that's what he's really trying to get at in all this. And now the Corinthians and us can take these same principles and apply them not only in marriage, not only in work, not only in life, but everywhere. Aren't those three good things? God is sovereign, I am content, and I will walk in a manner worthy of my calling. So, next time we will pick up as Paul transitions out of this, and there's some very interesting things. Chapters 8 through 10 are all one unit, so we'll talk about that in our next lesson.